can go ahead.
Thank you. So yeah, today we'll cover as much as possible with regard to Sitecore and certification. I'll share my knowledge about this certification and also some basics required to cover this in the next 1 hour. So let's get going. So these are some of the topics we will cover. This is based on what is covered in the exam as well as what is in the curriculum. So you can find the curriculum in the exam e-learning course, as well as I've got a blog here, just pulled out everything that's there in the e-learning course and put it here, so that you can check. Some general things so that the exam is 50 questions, 2 hours. It is multiple choice exam. Some questions might have to ask you to select 3 or 4 options at a time, but most of the questions are one option at a time. You can mark it for review. It's online proctored. One thing that I found was in one of the exams, although I had a laptop camera, they stopped me and they asked me to use a separate side camera. So they stopped my exam, and the next day I got the camera and I went and wrote the exam. So it should be positioned in a sideways. So maybe you want to take care of that. Apart from that, a lot of people ask me about discount, what Sitecore gives or whatever. So normally, if there's a partner coupon that your company has, you can avail that. And before booking your exam, you normally get about 70% discount. So that's something you can probably look with your employer. So throughout this presentation, I've got links everywhere relevant to each of the topics that we cover. So let's first start with the CI installation errors. This is one of the important area in the exam. 1 or 2 questions can be in this area. So normally the questions will be like they give you an error and they ask you to interpret. Your ability to interpret based on the errors is what is tested here. So if you look at this case, like I got a sample error. So in this case, you can figure out that there is something wrong with the path based on test path. Then the answer option will be something like missing certificates path, missing certificates or something like that. But obviously something which points to path is what you need to pick up. So there might be questions like that. One more example of a CI installation error could be something like this, where your solar path is not proper. So obviously you can interpret, right, based on what is given here, like cannot find path. So this will be one of the options. One thing that I found out is it's not the Sitecore exam is not very close with regard to options. But what happens sometimes is like I have seen one question wherein you could mix up Sitecore instance and SQL Server instance. So that those two will be 2 options. Like they would give you username password is wrong. They would have got an option for Sitecore instance, username password is wrong, and by mistake you could select that. So just be aware of that. Otherwise, this is a very easy exam. Although the pass percentage is 80, if you're very careful about the options, you read it properly, you should get through it. So that's what I have felt in the exam compared to other exams that I've released from Sitecore. So over to the next slide. So this is one basic thing you always see, right? Like master database and web database difference that is still there in this Sitecore 10 exam. If you look at it, at least about 35 questions will be with regard to the basics of what was there in 8, 9 and all that. But then that last 15 questions, which is like if you got to get 40 out of 50, right? So the last 15 questions will be the 10 concepts, so which is very vital. Like for example, Sitecore CLI, Docker, and then ASP.NET Rendering SDK. So that's why that 15 questions out of 50 is really important. But if you cover your basics like anything regarding rendering, our final rendering, shared rendering and all that, if you're really good about that, then you should be able to get a comfortable score. So if you look at the master versus, excuse me, master versus WebDB difference. So obviously the master database is used by the content editors. Look out for keywords, like if the option says unpublished content, then that means master database. If it's published content, it means web database. So these are some things we have been used to in the past certification. So we should be able to cover. And obviously, if they say from database A to B, it's published, obviously the database A is a master and the database B is a web. So I'm just throwing out errors, but most commonly it will be like unpublished content, published content, keywords like that. Then live users are using the website. or what database they would be using. So web is the option. So such kind of questions can be there. So these are the simple ones you can get right. So over to the next slide. So these are some of the other points that you should be aware of. MasterDB to edit content, while WebDB is used to store live data. I think most of us who have been working in Sitecore knows this. So this is a simple one. Content changes made in WebDB will be overwritten by next publish. So always changes must go from master to web. So which is sometimes I sometimes used to wonder, like we have in the WebDB a publish option. So initially when I used to work, I used to make changes and publish there. But then I realized that, okay, it should go from master to web. That's where when you go in a distributed environment, you'll have the content editors using the master database. That's a CM environment. And then the CD will be pointing to the web database, right? But yeah, so that's something we need to be aware of. And that's tested in the exam wherein why should you not make changes in the web database and publish? That's because the next time when the content editor makes a change in master database and publishes, it will overwrite what is there in web database. So that's something we need to be aware and which we probably know as seasoned Sitecore developers. Then where can you find the publishing wizard is something that you need to be aware. Content editor, experience editor, Sitecore desktop, or some of the places or 3 places where you find the publishing wizard. Excuse me. So they normally don't test you anything about, the distributed environment or anything like that, but it's good to be aware of, there is a content delivery server which points to your core database, and then the content management server points to your master database. And there's a publish that takes place from master to web to move the content. So next thing is the very, very common basic concept like templates and data templates, right? Templates are nothing but your data structures, and they have your data, right? So that's something we need to be aware. Then data is grouped by field sections, right? And then you have fields within them, and each of them has data type. And you can also where to get the data from the content tree. The source column will specify that, right? For example, drop tree. We need to specify where in the content tree we need to pick up the data. So that's something we need to be aware of. There's a source column which stores this information. So another concept that would be tested is inheritance, right? So now if you're having a field section which has title and description, then obviously when you have two templates using the same thing, then if you have to create a base template, you will use the whole section, right? Section, as you say, what some name like fields, right? Or content. You move the whole thing, content, title and description together as a base template section, right? So that's something that's normally tested. So when you select types like multi-list, drop tree list, you must set the source to. Yeah, that's something we know. So multi-list drop tree list, they must have a source which points to the content content tree. Docker, it should be about 5 to 6 questions, like 4, like if just think about it, right? Like if I say 15 questions, so somewhere around 4 to 5 questions from each of these new topics like Docker, CLI, and ASP.NET Rendering SDK. But what I felt was these questions were a lot more simpler compared to the actual questions which apply your knowledge of inheritance and all that. But as somebody who has worked in Sitecore, you'll be easily able to score in the inheritance concept, because that's something we do on a day-to-day basis, right? So that should not be an issue. But one area I thought it was difficult was I think the ASP.NET Rendering SDK, and that area was initially tricky for me. So that's something we are not used to, and we have not done much projects. So, but then if you're aware that this is what they are testing, then you should be fine with that area. So let's get going. Standard values or default value for field. We know this. Then they are the fallback value when field values null, right? So when you're creating a template, it's a best practice to set your standard values, right? That's something we have been always told, and there are a lot of blogs like Rohan's blog covers these tokens. So you normally specify a token also, right? For the title field, you normally put a dollar name so that when they type the name, it will automatically picked up in that content. So that's something we know of. So good practice to set up presentation details, since it standardizes content creation process, right? So why do we set presentation details? Because we don't want every content editor to add their own presentation details, right? So it's better to set on the template level in the standard value. So that's something we need to be aware of, and we normally do it. So this is one, probably you can look at this. Links like these I have added everywhere, links that are very important and towards the exam topic. So next one, template inheritance. So we talked about this. So some common questions might be like 2 or 3 templates have two fields together. So are they a candidate for which of these fields are candidate for base template? So you have to find out, like in banner they will say title, description, blurb, CTA image. Article will also will have that. And rating also will have the title, description, score, reviewer, date of review. Then then they might have options wherein they say title, description, author, which is not the right one. Obviously, you have to pick up something which is common for all these 3, right? So that's something we need to be aware of. If a field with same name across 2 templates point to 2 different data sources, then it is not a candidate for inheritance. So this is something we need to be aware of. Like if you have a title and a description field, and the description has a totally different source in the content tree compared to another field in another template, then description is definitely not a candidate for inheritance. You need to pick up only names. So that's something you need to be aware of. Let's go to the next slide. So let's get into Sitecore MVC Concepts. I will pick up the questions later. I think it's on the channel. So let's cover this and I'll pick up the questions. So generally you have the MVC concepts, right? For every Sitecore definition, there's going to be a corresponding CSHTML, right? So that's something we need to be clear. This was something very confusing for me when I initially started, but that's how content management systems work, right? So here they have a layout definition item, and then you have a layout file, right? One is CSHTML, one you define in Sitecore, and then you map both of them together. Similarly for view rendering, that's the concept. And controller rendering slightly different, wherein you point to the controller and the method, right? There's a lot of blocks out there, but then just this basic understanding is enough. Like how is a view rendering, what is the composition of a view rendering, right? There's a definition in Sitecore, then there is a CSHTML file. And obviously, this is something they test, like when do you use the view rendering and things like that. Let's get into detailed concept. Like the Sitecore MVC concept, we have layout details. From the presentation detail, you can get to the layout detail. So that's a confusing area, right? They use this presentation and all that very, what do you call that? Like interchangeably, right? But then layout details, when you look at layout details, one second, I was just trying to show something, but let's keep going with this. So is somebody using, can you leave the mouse? I mean, I'm not able to use the mouse. Yeah, okay. So when you look at layout details, you have the layout definition, then you have the placeholder definition, the rendering definition, which is nothing but when you open the layout details from the presentation details for a rendering, you'll have the layout on top, and then you have the placeholder, and then you have what rendering, where it should, I mean, what is the data source for that rendering. So, and then for corresponding CSHTML file will have your placeholders, and then you'll have for each rendering the template field, which will actually sit within the placeholder, right? For each of the layout within the layout. So, and then you have for each placeholder, you'll have what all the allowed controls, and then these renderings you'll be putting it there. For example, one placeholder will have header, mobile header, or drop-down header. So that will be part of your header placeholder. Then your main might have hero banner, some other banner. So those things will be part of a main placeholder. So that's what I've tried to represent here. So to give a quick idea, like you have layout details, which is again your layout definition. Then you have within that, you specify placeholders. For each of them, there is rendering. So that's something I've tried to represent here. So now within presentation details, one thing that they normally check is what happens if you remove any of the layout details, right? Answer is quite straightforward. Obviously, your rendering will not be visible because it's like a connecting path, right? Like in your CSHTML, there is a placeholder. If you remove that totally, then or if you remove this here, there's going to be a mandatory option. It's going to say don't. It's mandatory and it's not going to allow you to save. But layout is the binding force, right? Like it acts as a binding force so that your renderings are visible in the page. So that's something we need to be aware of. And then, so I tried to remove one of the layouts. So you get this layouts are mandatory for presentation details with controls. So that's something we need to be aware of. And what I did was I went and removed the main placeholder in the CSHTML. So obviously there's no rendering visible. So this is our default page where I made this change. So this is something that they test normally. What happens if layout is not there or layout is removed completely? So that's something we need to be aware of. Placeholder is, this is a very common question. Somebody who has taken Sitecore 8 or 9, there will obviously be a question about placeholder ID, placeholder key. So that's definitely there even in this exam. So you need to be sure that there's a placeholder key. There's nothing like a placeholder ID. So that's something you need to be aware of. Placeholder is uniquely identified by placeholder key. So that's something you need to be aware of. So renderings, when you look at renderings, which are nothing but our controls. So within a rendering, we can have a checkbox. Checkbox or tree list cannot be rendered using @html.sitecore.field. Can you please be in mute? Narendra Kumar, please. Checkbox or tree list cannot be rendered using html.sitecore.field. So that's because checkbox is a complex field. We have got some, if you look at this, some of the explanations here, you will get some explanation about why checkbox cannot be rendered using html.sitecore.field. Tree list is also a complex field, so this cannot be rendered using html.sitecore.field. And we have something called as compatible rendering. This is picked up from the MVP side. So compatible rendering is a component that can be replaced with another component, providing both use the same data source or no data source at all. Example, use the same type of data. So they both use the same type of data or from the same template. So those things can be grouped under compatible rendering. So these are all compatible renderings, which means that they can go in the same placeholder. So that's something we need to be aware of about compatible rendering. The main difference between, we need to be aware of this definition about compatible rendering and allowed controls. So compatible renderings have the same data source and they might not have data source at all. So that's something we need to be aware of. So general Sitecore MVC tips like dynamic component binding useful in personalization, because you can add the components, right? That's the whole idea. Because static component binding, you just directly specify the rendering in the CSHTML, but in dynamic component binding, you can have a placeholder and you can switch over any allowed control in that placeholder. So that's the idea of dynamic component binding. And obviously it will be used in personalization, because obviously if you can put it at design time, at runtime also you can write code to switch components. Static component binding useful for fixed header or footer and disallows content editors to remove the component. When you say static component binding, you directly put the rendering there in the page so that nobody touches that. So this is a very classic scenario for header, footer, where you're sure that header or footer is not going to change. So that's something we need to be aware of. That's called a static component binding. Configure rendering data source location to restrict content editors to select content from a specific location in a content tree. So in a rendering, you can specify the data source location, right? So the whole point of that is we want to restrict only one part of the tree rather than exposing the whole tree, because they might be in a total different template and it might not fit, it might cause some error. So that's something. What is the difference between data source location and data source template within a rendering, right? With the data source template is filtering you based on template for that renderings, the data source, but data source location filters in the tree, but that be totally different template there. So that's the main difference. That both of these are set in the rendering. So that's why I added a screenshot, so you can take a look at this. And here you have a link that differentiates between view rendering and controller rendering. So that's something you can take a look. So insert options is used mainly to restrict what items can be added, right? Like a content editor wants to add a content item, you intuitively show them what they can add under folder. So That's where insert options are useful. Good practice to set up insert options on standard values of an item template. You can set insert options on an item in the content tree as well. So this is something they test. Why do you have to set standard values in the template, and when do you add one more insert option in the content tree? It's basically because you want to give them additional options from what is there in the standard values, right? So that's something they normally test. The former allows inserting only specific type of items, while the latter option is useful when you want to add additional items. So that's the main difference why they ask you provide insert options in the content tree apart from what's there in the standard values. So next thing is field editor button. Field editor buttons allow you to enhance the user experience for a given component. There may be some field options that are not available in Experience Editor, and you have to edit the content via the content editor. This overall is not a good user experience. This is where Experience Editor buttons help and improve the Sitecore user experience. So you add buttons, and for some fields which you cannot edit, you normally go by adding those controls and then provide the option for the content editors to edit. So one of the other best practices in non-SXA sites, you normally have two sites, and then anything that's shared between the sites, you have to put it as a separate tree. So shared content should be stored outside of any one site's content tree structure, which is a best practice. And you have a blog here which talks about that. So just go through that. So next thing is static versus dynamic placeholder, which is a very favorite topic. So obviously I've tried to represent simply with a diagram, like in static placeholder, same name, same placeholder name, you cannot add in the page. And even if you add, it will put the same controls within. So if you want to add separate set of controls, then you go for dynamic placeholders with the keyword dynamic placeholder. So that's where you can add the same name and you can add different controls within that placeholder. So that's something you need to be aware of. Static placeholder, if you have a unique name for static placeholder, obviously you can go about doing this. But if you have the same name, then you need to go for dynamic placeholder because it automatically, appends your ID. So that's something. So let's go through dynamic placeholder. When you use dynamic placeholders, you can add the same placeholder name several times on the page. You can do this across multiple renderings, and you can even use the same placeholder multiple times in a rendering. Dynamic placeholders mean that unique keys are guaranteed across different renderings and within one rendering. You can build functionality that generates multiple placeholders within the same rendering dynamically. So this is something you need to be aware of. Like, why do we use dynamic rendering, dynamic placeholders? Because you want to add multiple components within the page. So that's where you go for dynamic placeholders. And main thing is at runtime, you can add as many components as you want, right? Like you have a grid, then you can go for something like a dynamic placeholder and add your components as per whatever you want to add within that. So just go through these links. There are some useful links where you can see how dynamic placeholders are created and things like that. So this is an example of a dynamic placeholder where you have that ID appended to it. You can see the data source specified. So these are something we are used to as a developer, but these were probably covered in the exam. So then one common thing is Visual Studio Publish. Like the question might not be directly asking you what is Visual Studio Publish, but then it might be in lines of like that you're you're changing an item in the code. Then how do you put it in the site? Obviously, you'll copy and paste because the Visual Studio Publish might publish the whole folder, or Sitecore Publish could be an option, right? But Sitecore Publish is not the answer because it just publishes from master to web database. But if you make a change to a file in your development environment, you just copy and paste to the web root folder. That's the correct and straightforward option. So there's a difference between code publish and visual and Sitecore Publish is what covered in those particular questions. So code publish different from content editor publish. Also remember that you can manually copy CSHTML files from your solution to the web root folder, right? That's what we normally do because sometimes we don't have that single item publish. If we don't configure and we are not sure whether that's working, then we manually copy and paste to the correct folder, right? So that's something tested, which is a very practical thing when it comes to exam. While writing C# code, Sitecore.context is utilized to get HTTP request details. So if you have written pipeline process, you can relate to this, right? Like if you have a Sitecore, there's an args argument that comes through the processing pipeline, but then sometimes you have to see the Sitecore context and then check what are the methods there. So we use Sitecore.context. So that's something that's useful. Confusing options will be like HTTP context dot something Sitecore.http context. So just be thorough with these methods, namespace, and class, which are commonly used. So that's something we need to be aware of. So next is version layout. Version layout is something similar to, it's not something, it's similar to final layout, wherein you can specify based on language, versions, different layouts, right? So you have a Christmas offer, then you want to specify a CT in the top 10% discount. So for that period or for that language or for the country, you would specify a version layout, right? Final layout, so that's something that's covered. Version layout make it possible to specify different layouts for different versions and languages of the same item. You use version layouts when you want to have different layouts for different languages, publish a specific version with its own layout for a specific period. So version layout means different languages, different versions and all that. So keep that in mind. So what's true regarding, so another take, what's true regarding version layouts? Version layouts make it possible to specify different layouts for different versions and languages for the same item. Use version layouts when you want to have different layouts for the same thing, but told in a different way. So just be aware about version layouts. Next one is site definition patch config. Patch config files are used to add additional functionality. They help us write pipeline processor code, right, to patch in after, before some pipeline. So one of the important thing is the site definition patch config. This patch file is used to accommodate multiple public facing sites and used to map home item to corresponding host name. Like you can have multiple sites, but they would point to different root item in the content tree, right? So that's something normally checked with regard to site definition patch config. So another thing is the load order of config files. There's a specific load order, right? Like the basic system files get loaded, then the Sitecore layer, those files get loaded, modules layer that gets loaded, then there's custom layer and the environment layer. So load order is how config files are loaded, and we have these layers within Sitecore, and it takes that as the guideline and loads those files, right? So that's something we need to be aware of. Sitecore defines the layers and the order in which they load at runtime in the website app_config/layers.config file. So layers.config file has the load order, and it specifies what should load first, next, and all that. The load of configuration files, basic system files get loaded first, and then comes the Sitecore layer, modules layer, custom layer, and environment layer. So you have a link there. You can check that. So this is a sample file. Sorry. This is a sample file. So this is the layers.config file, and you have the load order here specified. And then you can see here, right? We are used to the Helix pattern. So this is what says: first load foundation layer folder files, then feature layer folder files, then project layer folder files. Then you load the environment files. So before that, you load all the system files. So that's something we need to be aware of. So load order, that could be confusing options like order load or whatever, just be aware of load order. Just it's part of layers.config file, and that's a patch file, so that we need to be aware of. So Sitecore support package is used when you face some errors, and it's basically an error in the Sitecore product, and we have to contact the Sitecore team, right? So they ask us to get the log files and send it to them. So this is something that they cover because it's a day-to-day use that we have to do, right? When new products are released, we should be aware of how to send contact Sitecore support and then send the file. So that's where Sitecore support package is useful. So I just created a screenshot of how to create a support package. So the purpose of the support package is to help Sitecore team replicate an issue without accessing the actual environment, right? So it's happening only in our environment. Like we might be using it in a totally new OS version, and there we are getting an error or something like that, or some special character we added that's causing the error in Sitecore product. So you go to this package, and then what you do, you just specify they ask you to specify the date when the issue happened. So you specify that range and then put all the details, what to collect. So you have set of things, that information that you can collect. So they might ask you to say, hey, just give me the Sitecore log files between these two dates. So then you just send this package to them, and then they will load that in their environment, and they can find the issue and resolve the issue for us. So Sitecore support package is used for that purpose. So it's used to help the Sitecore team to resolve issues without accessing our environment. So that's one of the important things. So next is Sitecore security domains. This is something we are used to, like domains fall into default, extranet, and Sitecore. So each of these we need to be aware of what are each of these. So when you look at default domain, so extranet is a very famous. It's a very famous question. So that's where you need to be aware of. This domain is a web security domain that contains the user accounts that correspond to the visitors of the website. It also contains the customized roles that manage read access to the content of the website. So you just need it needs to ring a bell like visitors, read access. So that's what is extranet is all about. Sometimes that could be answers which say, hey, web service or something like that. So, but then this is more in line with, if you find something like visitor and read level access, that's the option that you need to pick up. So members of the extranet domain that are also members of relevant Sitecore roles. For example, Sitecore client authoring can access the Sitecore domain and use the client tools to edit the content of the website. Next is Sitecore domain. This domain is an internal security domain that contains all the users who can access the Sitecore clients and the Sitecore client rules that influence the functionalities that are available to users. It also contains the customized roles that control the access the users have to items. So just be aware of these definitions. Then the default, this is a virtual domain that only exists in memory. Sitecore is set up with extranet as a default domain, and most users' accounts will be extranet anonymous when they visit the site. So that's something about extranet, Sitecore, and default domains. Next thing is the allowed course origin. If you have worked with commerce, you might have seen in the identity, Sitecore identity file, there is a production folder. Under the production folder, you will have a file where it will say, because there's commerce site, and then you might also have horizon to access. So these two will be put under allow course origin because the domain name is totally different, right? Like if you look at it, sc10 comm sc.dev.local, this is a domain name. And if you look at this one, this is com horizon, right? So how would the ID server know that it should authenticate requests from both of these? So that's why you add it under allowed course origin, so that ID server, when they put the proper username and password and they say, okay, this name is here, I will allow this particular request. So that's where allowed course origin is really useful. So any sites you want, you put it under this under this path. And most important thing is you should not end this with slash. It should be without slash, because it's a course origin actually. So origin normally is this part. So that's something we need to be aware of. So familiarize with when it goes to user manager, you can create users that we know, but there are other options, right? Like when you go to user manager, you have unlock option. Unlock option is useful when I attempted multiple times and I've gone past the 3 attempts. Then my administrator can unlock me, so that without even changing the password, I can log in. So that's something unlock does. So that we need to be aware where it is sitting under the user manager. There is an option called unlock. So that's something we need to be aware of. Then you have role manager, domain manager, all these you need to be aware of. Like just be aware of all these options within the user manager. So workflows, what are the all of the following workflow items are stored in the content tree. So you have workflows, states, commands, and actions. So workflows have different states, right? Like they have draft and review, approve, right? So those states you need to be aware of. And workflow commands are normally found in content editor, experience editor, and workbox. So elements of a workflow, states, commands, actions. So what we saw the previous, but it's just terminology. So workflow, elements of workflow or states, commands, and actions. Then there is workbox. So the Workbox gives you an overview of all items that are in workflows and enables you to manage these items. So just have a look at the UI, what is covered in the Workbox, the grouping of items based on the state. So for each item in a workflow state, you can preview, open, and compare different versions of the same item. You can also set up an RSS feed. So just take a look at this particular Workbox option and just be aware of you have the different states here, right? So those things just need to be aware. That's all. So when it comes to security, you can select roles and group roles. So that's something we need to be aware of. You can add users as a member of a role. So can edit roles for a user. You can add roles to a user. Then you can add users to a role. So those things, this is a members option is what is useful to add members to a role. So you can click and add users through this role, through this option. Then this relationship we need to be aware of. You can assign members to role, and then permissions are assigned to roles. So members sit within a role, and then each role has a set of permissions. So that's something we need to be aware of. So let's jump on to Asp Co Rendering Host. Anytime a user accesses a site, the request goes to rendering host, and that rendering host actually hosts the rendering engine and the layout service client. And this contacts the headless service, and the headless service in turn contacts your backend, which is the Sitecore content management server. So just keep this in mind. So this part sits in CD, and this is the CM. Okay, so that's why the whole concept of headless is you can consume from here, right? And you can add your own application to use this. So that's where it's lightweight also, because this rendering engine, whatever runs here, it uses the model to contact the headless service, and the headless service just pulls through an API any content that's required. So this is lightweight because it is self-sufficient most of the times, but then even otherwise it is not bulky in terms of having everything that's needed. It just makes a call and gets it. So that's where it's faster, and that's where it's sitting in the CD also. That's one thing. So you need to be aware of the architecture, how we normally set up this whole thing. You need to be aware what will be sitting in the CD and what will be part of CM. So that's something very important. So let's go to the next slide. So this is another view of this part of the Sitecore documentation. So you can see here, like the developers do their development in the workstation and they push to the rendering host. The visitors access the rendering host, and then that access the headless service. So even from this side, you can have visitors accessing the headless services, and they can use it for some other application. And this part is the Sitecore management service, which is nothing but your CLI. So you can push items to your instance, and then that will be serialized in the file system and then go to the source control. Then you have your launchpad, which is nothing but your CM instance. Content authors work with that. So this is something you need to be aware. And so this is a different view we talked about. Rendering host has the rendering host layout service client, data model sitting, and then you have the rendering engine. So the user talks to the exe, and then any data is needed, it comes through this part, right? Through the data model, which decouples the whole architecture. It's more like a view model kind of thing, so that this is on its own. So that's something we need to be aware. Next, we'll jump into some of the some of the responsibilities of each of the layers. Like if you check any ASP.NET Core application, I use the MVP application, where you have a layer called shared layer, then you have a platform and a rendering. Okay, so these are the responsibilities of each of the layers. I don't think you need to get into so much detail, but just for the sake of understanding ASP.NET Rendering Host and SDK, I just put this together. Just go through it in terms of what is the responsibility. Like if you look at this, any call will be here, everything will be a controller and a method. Okay, so you will call a controller method from here to other rendering host. Like there will be, I'll show you the next slide, which will be a lot more clear. But then the whole idea is there will be a lot of controller methods in this particular layer, and then your actual service or the Sitecore related logic or processing will be sitting here. This is generally any sharing of logic and things like that. But main part is this, which is a front-facing application, And then here your services can be sitting, which is your Sitecore logic sits here. So that's something you need to be aware. This is mainly about service registration, or what do you call that, dependency injection. You will have feature layer, one feature layer interface having you map it to implementation. All that happens in this particular layer. There's a startup class which is your .NET Core concept. There you do all the mapping. So you try as much to do in the client side in terms of writing as much code in the startup without going to the backend. But then, yeah, there might be scenarios where you have to call another API, and that does the job. So the responsibilities are segregated. So everything is a controller. Hello. Okay, next one. So I just put that as a diagram. Like when you have a request coming, if you have the MVP site, the request reaches the MVP site exe, okay, then that in turn has dependency to navigation rendering, which is nothing but your views, forms. These are all your controller and the method, okay. And anytime you want to call a logic behind, then you go this way. Like here there is forms. Form has controller, and this calls a service here, and then calls a shared method here. So it goes here. So anytime if you have anything to do here, like cross-cutting function, that will be exposed as a service here, so that this will be consumed here, and it will go this way. So that way you don't you minimize the, what do you call that, dependency, and make it a lot more clear segregation. So everything, just think about anything comes here as a headless thing, like it's exposed as controller and an API, and this part should consume this. So the core front end should consume all these headless services. So that way Psycore logic also will be sitting somewhere here, and you can consume through a controller here, and that controller will be invoked from this front end application. So that should be in your mind. So that's something good to have in mind. So basically in the exam, they cover only basic stuff in terms of what are the features and things like that. They don't give you code or anything like that and ask you to write code or anything related to architecture or design. But it's good to have an idea. So some of the features of ASP.NET Core application are, it's independent and they render Sitecore content. Its whole idea is to render Sitecore content because from the backend there's a service, and that service is can be consumed either by the front end or totally different application. It's totally decoupled because we have multiple layers. We saw that, right? Like we have a layout service, then we have the core application, then there's a model in between them. So the model decouples the whole thing. It's lightweight because there's an exe, and that exe is the front end, and it's consumed by, it's used by the rendering host. So it consumes the layout service, which is the right side. We saw the right side or the left side, or the top is the layout service, which calls the CM, and then the bottom is your host, right? So this consumes your layout service. You can also preview code changes. I have not done this personally, but maybe there's an option where you can check it in the experience editor or anything. I have not seen that, but it's good to be aware of all these features of ASP.NET Core application. So again, in ASP.NET Rendering SDK, there are few view types. So main ones are the model-bound view, custom view, and then partial view. It's good to understand the difference between these. So let's move on to next slide where I put it properly. So model-bound are most commonly used, like what we use in our what do you call it, controllers. It's similar to that, and it's backed by a model, view backed by a model. But custom view is reusable. It's complex logic. And then something like navigation menus, login panels, search bar, which is reused across the site, right? Those things fall under custom view. Partial view is anything structured, like placeholders. It doesn't have any logic, so it doesn't have any content of its own, but it's a partial view. So that's why it's called as partial view. So you would be mostly tested about the difference between custom view and partial view. So just be aware about the correct name and what are the capability of each of the views. So that's something called a startup.cs in the core project. So what it does is it registers the Sitecore layout service client invoked by the Sitecore rendering engine, registers the Psycore Rendering Engine Services. Mostly it's about registering, okay? So any implementation, dependency injection, all that happens here. Map a Sitecore rendering component name to an implementation. Forwarding of scheme as X-forwarded proto to the layout service. Enable support for the experience editor. So there are methods there to enable, and there are also the advantage of core is it has one-liners to show the sitemap XML, robot.txt. That's very good. Actually, you don't need to write any code. So if you just put the sitemap file, it automatically shows it for you. So that's a great thing. Standard ASP.NET Core routing and static file support. This is where I was talking about, controller mapping and all that. So it says in this particular, go here and go within this feature, map this controller. So that way, here you'll have all the controllers across projects mapped in the startup.cs. So that is something useful and makes it lightweight. Okay, so. So these are when you do service registration. So this is something how you register at model bound view. So this is your definition, and then this is your UI name. So add model bound view, add partial view. Just learn about this, know about the syntax. Add view component. So if you this straightforward, add view component is for custom view. Model bound view has add model bound view. Add partial view. Only thing is if our option says add view partial, you shouldn't get confused. So just be aware of this exact syntax. So next is Sitecore CLI. So this is an overall overview of Sitecore CLI. You have a .NET new tool manifest command which creates a .NET tools.json, and then so you should be aware this is the PowerShell. Okay, so the user sends the command, and it goes and creates in the file system and comes back telling that this is done, right? So next step is Sitecore.Cla add source. You are specifying you are actually the concept of Sitecore Cli. Cli is a plugin, so you have to install that plugin. So it comes back the version and it is installed, and then Sitecore's init command creates your Sitecore.json file. So these are specific files which have specific functionalities. We'll see that in the next couple of slides. So then you can add a plugin name which adds a subfolder, and that has all the now the PowerShell can respond to all the commands that is part of serialization or anything, whatever you are registering. So that's what happens here. So let's move on to the next slide to see what these are. So the Sitecore.json. So Sitecore.json, module.json, these are two files we need to be aware of because this is something very useful for serialization. Specifies what CLI plugins were installed. So you can see it here, right? So this when you do the one of the commands there, like register, then it automatically updates this file, the configuration schema.json, and then you can if plugins are not installed, commands would not be available, right? So if you're not registering a plugin, obviously the commands will not be available. When I say commands, if you go back, any command for that matter, like you can see the commands here, right? Sitecore index. This is because this is part of another plugin called index. But similar to this, your serialization will have serialization push, pull, and all that. So those commands will not be available. And if you can go and check in this NuGet folder, if serialization package is not there, then those commands will not be available. And it is also linked to this also. So this if you remove from here, it will not work. So if plugins are not installed, commands will not be available. Yeah, that's one common thing. The module section specifies location of JSON files having serialization information. So here, if you check the modules, this is nothing but it's telling go anything under this child folder, 2 levels down, you find the module.json. The module.json is nothing but your file that says what path should be serialized. Like for example, from here, serialize anything under the feature folder. So that kind of information will be in the module.json. We'll see that in the next slide. But this is very important information for the file. If you remove this, it will not do any serialization. Or if the module.json is not there in that particular folder, that particular folder will not be serialized. So these are some things we need to be aware of. If the module.json path is not specified here, serialization will not happen. So that's what we covered. So there is a module.json. You might have for each folder product like project dot site dot module.json. So and then feature dot forms dot module.json. You have to create these files actually. The module.json should be added to all folders where serialization must take place. The module.json has item includes that specifies what path must be serialized from the Sitecore tree. If no module.json is present in a folder or content tree path is not specified in module.json, the concerned path is not serialized. .NET Sitecore's SCR pull used to serialize items to file system. .NET Sitecore SCR push used to deserialize items from the file system to Sitecore. So this SCR command will not be available if your plugin is not installed or that particular file, your Sitecore.json file does not have this particular command. So this is a structure of the module.json. So you can see here like what path should be included, name of the include, then which path, and this is called scope. So there are 4 options for scope. Just be aware of those options. So whether you have to create, update, or delete, whether you have to just create, you should not update or delete. So these options you should be aware of. Then yeah, scope has following values: single item. So if you're pointing to a single item, just serialize that item. Item and children means all the item and just the immediate children. Item and descendants means that item and all the children, grandchildren. Descendants only means leave out the item and any descendants like the grandchildren, children, they should all be serialized. Default values, item and descendants. Item and descendants means this item and all the children, grandchildren. That is the default value. So push operation, you have create and update and delete. So default values create, update and delete. I hope this is straightforward because you are saying just create, or you say create and update, don't delete. You say create, update and delete. In this case, it will not do update also and delete also. This is something we need to be aware of. It's actually allowed push or pull. So yeah, but then they look at it as point of pushing because that's how terminology is. Okay. So scope has these values. Single item, we talked about this. So these are ignored. You can ignore. So you can have rules also which specify completely, except for these things in the top, ignore other things in the bottom. Like that, you can write rules, but those things are not really important for the exam. But you just be aware of single item and children, all the scope, what are the values, what are the items, the create item and all that stuff. So there is something called a Sitecore for Visual Studio, which is a visual UI tool similar to CLI, but only difference is that it has a visual effect. In CLI, you have to write commands, but here it's a tool where you can select options. But both are if you're working in a team environment, somebody can use Visual Sitecore for Visual Studio while you are comfortable using Sitecore CLI. But only problem is which Sitecore for Visual Studio is licensed version, but then they can work together. That's not a problem. So both tools are created by Sitecore, so that's something we need to be aware of. So visual configuration of modules and environments, visual synchronization of items, including conflict handling. So that's a good thing. So it's very similar to what do we have? I think we had that I forgot the name. Like we used to do serialization, right? Which is a plugin tool. So similar to that.
I guess TDS.
Yeah, TDS. Cool. So this is 10.10 version. Yeah. Sitecore Docker lifecycle. So just be aware of the flow. You fill variable values. So variable values, you can use a script. Normally we use a script to write and fill this .env file. And then that .env file feeds into Docker compose.yml and Docker compose override.yml. So just be aware there's a Docker compose YML, and then you upd, then containers are up and running. So this is how you check your containers. So Docker compose logs -f container name or rendering name, whatever. I mean, so this is something we need to be aware of. Then the logs are displayed when you do that, and then you Docker compose down, the containers are stopped. So just be aware of the Docker compose up or Docker compose logs -f, so that syntax, we need to be just be aware of these common commands. From Sitecore 10, Sitecore Container Registry provides base container images for production and deployment development environments. So before that, it was just a third-party, open source thing. Now Sitecore 10 has taken responsibility that it is going to support production and development environments. So then within the env file, you have different sections. Since somebody who has used Docker should have seen these environment variables, and these get passed to your Docker Compose and Docker override files. So the host license file folder has a physical path, but your there is a Sitecore license which is more of a encrypted value. So you can check this Sitecore exchange wherein if you sometimes you can receive a conversion error, or even otherwise, if you remove one of the values in the Sitecore license file, obviously it's not going to work, right? So that time, or you want for better security, obviously go for the host license folder so that each developer has the license in their that particular location, and you can check in this file. But yeah, when do you go for host license folder? That's something you need to be aware of. That's all, I think. So I will check the questions. What are the questions? How do I reach the questions here?
Navan, what I can do is maybe since you're sharing the screen, you will not be able to. So I can narrate those questions to you.
Yeah, sure. Thank you.
So most of them you have answered, but I'll just go it one by one, and you can just answer it again if it's
Sure, thank you. Yeah.
Yeah. So the first thing is, can we enroll for Sitecore 10 certification from Sitecore Learning Portal? Because I'm not able to see certification enrollment in catalog.
I went to the actual what do you call that? I've got a I'll share the other blog, or even otherwise other MVPs have written blogs about WebAssessor, right? In WebAssessor, you directly go do that. But if you are looking for, that's where the coupon, I think the site, okay, the Sitecore site doesn't have a coupon. So anyway, you have directly go to the WebAssessor tool, and there you can put the coupon code. So I don't know what is the idea of going to the Sitecore portal? Can I know that?
I'm not sure.
Why?
Maybe they just want to enroll. How to enroll it will be around the question will be. So there are, I'll just answer it quickly. It's
Yeah,
that
yeah.
you have two options to enroll. One is the web assessor where you can enroll to different examination where you need to go to their portal and search for Sitecore. And
Mm.
second is Sitecore developer portal that was launched recently. So where you can just go and search for certification and you will get couple of new certifications as well.
Yeah, but they
Right.
actually go and launch the WebAssessor only. Finally, we have to go and register there only. That's what I've seen.
Yes. Yeah, I
Mm.
think Akshay has posted that link in the chat.
Cool.
Yes. So next
Yes.
question is, do we also need to explore headless concept as well for the certification?
No, the basic idea is enough. Like, what is like where does headless, like we saw that, right? The CD environment has headless service, and then we have that kind of basic information should be more than enough. You won't be asked anything more than that actually. Those diagrams should suffice actually, as far as I see.
The next is, have you observed common question between Sitecore 9 and Sitecore 10 examination?
Um, at least from the concept point of view, we have similar questions like the template inheritance, web database, master database. Those 35 questions are almost familiar to us. Just the 15 questions could be different. That's all.
Okay, got it. The second is, I'm going through the Sitecore 10 with .NET certification. What are the other document I need to go through along with Sitecore 10 documents?
Sitecore 10 documents. Just go through the portal. There, I have the link out here, which is the first one. You have it points to the learning portal only. You can go through that. Apart from that, just cover the learning URLs. That's all e-learning URLs. That should be fine.
Okay, thanks. And Navan, there are many requests for your PPT slides to be shared, so we need to post it somewhere
Yeah,
and
sure.
share the link with the participants.
Cool.
Uh,
Yeah,
the,
I will do that.
how much we need to look into .NET Core in case of Sitecore.NET Rendering for examination?
Just look at what is the functionality of startup.cs. Apart from that, there's nothing majorly different. Just look at what is the role of startup.cs, and that's all. Nothing much apart from that, as far as I remember.
Okay. Does Sitecore 10 certification expire?
Sitecore 10 certification, I don't know, maybe 2 years. You remember, Roy? Do you remember?
So from Sitecore 9.2, I think there is no expiry date on the certifications. That's my assumption. And
Okay.
before that, it was
Yeah,
valid for 2 years.
yeah,
But
that
what,
is true.
how,
No expiration. Yeah.
yeah. So after Sitecore
Okay.
9.2, there is no expiration date for this.
Okay.
Yeah. The next question is, sorry, how many questions on Horizon or Kubernetes or personalization?
Inyong ikuyog ang kwan, ang bata.
Horizon, and there are not any questions on Horizon and all that. This all new concepts, right? They are not covering all this, DXP, nothing about that. Questions, no, or even about personalization, there are not any questions, but just very basic ones. Like, I think the exam is more basic than anything related to advanced developers, so you should be able to handle. If you know about placeholders and all that, you should be able to handle those questions.
Yes. The next question I see is around the portal not accepting the credit card. So how did you do your payment? And I had done previously from a guy on site.
I don't know. It was accepted for me. If I had money, it accepted most of the times. Like I use
Yes.
debit card, obviously. If I had money, it's going to accept. That's what I've seen. I don't know what is the situation.
Yes. Even I have used my credit card and debit both
Yeah,
and it worked. Maybe you can give
yeah,
it a try this time.
yeah,
Yeah.
right.
Only one catch in the credit card is your credit card should be activated
So,
for this thing, international
ah,
transaction.
okay. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the catch. Maybe your card is not activated for international transaction. If it is activated, then you can pay in dollars.
Mm.
The next question is, as we have Sitecore serialization now, is this a replacement for TDS and Unicorn? Also, can we ask or inform clients that no more TDS license is required if they are using it in built-in within Sitecore?
I think the bigger challenge is to convince them to move to 10, right? I don't know. That feels to me a bigger challenge. If you can do that, then obviously we have to think about how to do the serialization. That I mean, if you're, I don't see apart from that any issues. So uh, I don't know. I'm not really clear what could be the issue. I mean, that's a totally different topic to discuss.
Yes, it's an open question, we should say.
Yeah.
Navan and Rohan, actually, TDS is not replaced, na? Sitecore 10. TDS still is in progress. So we have multiple
Yes.
options, whether we can use
Yeah.
TDS or the Sitecore
Yeah.
serialization.
Yeah.
Yes, they will never replace TDS with anything because it's a paid one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And even Sitecore for Visual Studio is kind in terms with TDS itself. So you
Mm.
need a license for that. It's not the free one. Only
Correct.
they have given an option as Sitecore CLI, which works similar to the Unicorn, and it's a free one.
Mm. Yeah.
Agree.
Yeah. The next is, does exam includes question around deployment on on-premise or Azure or Sitecore Managed Cloud?
No. No, that's I don't remember anything like that.
Okay, thank you. So respecting the time of the participants, there is two things we need to do now, Navan. One is
Okay.
you need to select a good question, two good
Mhm.
questions, so they get the vouchers for the asking good questions. And then you can stop sharing and maybe you can go to the participant list and randomly select two participants as a lucky winners.
Can I leave it to you? I'm fine with it. Whatever you select.
No, no. If I select, then it will be partiality, right? I am an organizer of SUG Pune, so I don't want to
I
because
don't know where it
big.
is. Where do you select that? I'm sorry.
Uh,
I'm just.
so it's four people gets the vouchers. So now we want to promote people to ask question when they are in the webinars. That's the idea for first two things. And second two
Oh.
things is they get it's kind of reward for attending. So it's kind of a lucky winners, right? And if me and Vinod cannot because we are the organizers, then everyone can say that there was a partiality. But yeah, it's not that presenter knows every participant, so you can have that selected.
So I have to give two